Book 4, Part 5. Is the movie set up for her to watch? Jonathan asked, turning his head towards Miss Mullender, but keeping me in his sight. I swallowed hard and stepped back so that I was now just behind Phil's shoulder. He leaned back a bit so we were touching and squared his shoulders. Almost, she stated, trying to sound chipper. She was just as shocked as I was by what was happening. He nodded and then turned back, but this time his eyes moved to Phil. Phil nodded and went to take a step forward. Whoa, what was happening? I reached out and grabbed his arm. Track was next to him now, and his hackles were firm. Phil smiled at me. It's okay. We're just going to go talk. No, I whispered, my eyes pleading. Track, take Reina to the theater and make sure she stays there, he chuckled at the end, trying to lighten the mood. That was not going to happen. There was no way I was going to let those two go anywhere alone. I looked at Jonathan. Why are you doing this? But he only turned and started to walk off. The two guards didn't follow. Phil turned to me. Tay, this needs to happen. It has to happen. When my eyes watered, he smiled. You had your chance to talk to him. Now I need to do the same. But he shook his head, then looked at Track. Take her to the theater. Track frowned, and Phil lifted his brow. Take Reina to the theater, and both of you stay there until I get there. We both stiffened a bit when his words carried the alpha growl. That's not fair, I whispered, glancing down the hall and then looking back at him. Please, I don't want you to go. I don't want... He chuckled. Are you afraid he can kick my butt? I flinched. No, I just don't want you fighting at all. Vampires were crazy strong and fast. Most werewolves weren't a match if the vampire had fought before, especially if the wolf was on two legs. But the thought of them fighting turned my stomach to rock, and I couldn't let it happen. How about if I promise you not to leave a single mark on him, he whispered, and Track chuckled. I frowned at my best friend, then looked back at Phil. I don't want you fighting at all. Tay, we are going to talk. We males can be civilized now and then, you know. I went to open my mouth, and he leaned over and kissed my cheek, then whispered in my ear, My honor as a male and as your mate needs this, Tay. Great. Now what could I say to that? Honor to a wolf was like air to a human or blood to vampire, but 10 times more important. If I begged him to stay, he would. I knew he would. But it would rob him of his right, and I couldn't bear to do that to him. I sighed and nodded, looking down at the floor. He lifted my chin and smiled. I'll come and watch the movie with you as soon as we're done. When I nodded, he looked at Track until he nodded too. My best friend didn't look much happier about it than I did, but he was a male and understood more than I could. Remember what I told you both, he stated, again letting that alpha vibration rumble through his words. My lip twitched in a smile, realizing Jackson and Rock weren't here yet. Track and I had to follow an alpha order, and Rock and Jay are to stay put too. My eyes widened and Track mumbled something under his breath. Phil smiled and chuckled. You two worry me. He kissed me again, turned, and headed down the hallway after Jonathan. The rest of the group stood silent. Even Miss Mullender looked paler than usual. Track took my hand, gave it a small squeeze, and then looked at her. So, where's this theater? She jumped a bit and blinked. Of course, right this way. Are we going to find a way to sneak out and... No, he shot back. He gave a direct order, Ray. I huffed. We had gone against orders before. Sort of. They were littler ones and never flat-out direct orders, but still. Track shook his head as we walked. They need to do this, Ray. There's too much other stuff going on to have their squaring off getting in the middle of it. We turned down another hallway and he smiled. Phil will set him straight. I winced. Jonathan wasn't the type to be set straight by anyone about anything. Like my dad, Jonathan was a vampire that had power and had had that power for a long time. He got what he wanted, how he wanted it, period. Jackson and Rock were already at the theater when we got there. They were excited to show us how amazing the room was, but Track told them what was happening in some other part of Oliver's massive home. Jackson whistled and plopped down in one of the 2 armchairs. Man, what I wouldn't pay to be a fly on that wall. I smacked his arms. It's not funny, I hissed, plopping down next to him. What if they get into a fight? Rock leaned over from the other side of Jackson, grinning. Then that poor Then Jonathan is about to get his butt kicked by one of the bests. Track growled, dropping into the seat on my left. You guys are not helping. Jackson shrugged, leaning on the armrest of his chair. Jeeps, they aren't gonna duke it out. It's not their style. Style? He nodded. Those 2 are both alphas in their worlds. Those guys talk. A lot. They don't brawl like we do, he said, turning and nodding to Rock, who smiled at me. Yeah, they square off. The musk would make you almost pass out. And then they use body language and this, he tapped his head. Brawling. That's easy, but what alphas do, he whistled, that would be amazing to see. Track growled again and I turned to him. But shouldn't he have you guys there with him, just in case? My best friend nodded hard. But we've been ordered to stay, so we will. His jaw was tight and I sat back hard. If I wasn't nauseous with worry, I would have realized just how amazing this room was. I would have looked over the rows filled with plush, individual lounge chairs, the large screen complete with a curtain, and been very impressed. As it was, I might have well have been sitting on a boulder. I closed my eyes and lowered my head. Please, Phil, please just talk to him. Get it over with and come back to me. The lights dimmed, the curtain pulled back, and the movie started. Track reached over and took my hand as a tear ran down my cheek. Chapter 7. Phil walked down the hall, his mind hard. He had to concentrate to keep his fists unclenched. He had been waiting for this, and he was ready. Partway down the hallway, someone called to him. He turned and looked down another corridor. Jonathan was standing there waiting. Phil followed, and they both walked silently into a room, and Jonathan shut the door behind them. Phil's wolf senses kicked in. He inhaled deeply, and his eyes searched the room. Both senses told him they were the only ones inside, but his ears heard guards post themselves on the other side of the door. He nodded. That was fair. There were no other doors, and the massive windows were sealed and covered in thick curtains. Jonathan walked over towards the desk, but then moved to the couch and sat. Phil moved to one of the armchairs that faced it and took his seat. The tension in the air was so thick it was nearly palpable. I know this is an uncomfortable situation, Phil finally started. Jonathan shook his head. The waiting is unnerving, but I'm not here just to talk about that. The waiting? Phil replied, trying to keep the surprise out of his voice. Jonathan's lip twitched in a hard smirk. Waiting until I have her back, which I will. Phil's brows rose, but he kept the rest of his face hard. I would normally say over my dead body, but we both know how that conversation would go. Jonathan nodded. Yes, we do. He sat back against the couch and shrugged. I guess we can get this part out of the way. The facts are so plain, but I need you to try. So let me see if I can help this along. Reina is mine. Period. Phil's hackles rose, but he kept his body still. I'm afraid you would get a different answer if you asked her. The vampire leaned forward then, resting his forearms on his knees. Reina is confused, and I'm allowing this to play out so that she can see the truth for what it is. When that happens, I will have my fiancé back. We will be unioned and allow what to play out? Your little game. You, meaning werewolves, Jonathan stated, shrugging. Reina is a very emotional female. Her heart has been torn in so many ways that I have decided not to rip it by further by forcing the issue just now. The truth will come out, and she will come back to me. He said with so much certainty, he sounded almost calm. So, you let her be with another male, Phil replied, annoyed that he was feeling his anger slipping. He had to stay in control. I love her more than you could ever realize, Jonathan replied, his voice and eyes dropping for a split second. Then he looked back across the rug. It sickens me to see you with her. We both know that. But she means more to me than anything, he sighed, glancing down at his hands. I have never loved anyone so much. He cleared his throat, and his business smile returned. Look around you, Mr. Astor, he gestured around the room. This is Reina's world. This is where she grew up. He nodded when Phil frowned. Her entire life has spent with every luxury known to any race. When Phil went to respond, Jonathan held up his hand. If you will. The wolf nodded slowly, sitting back in the chair and trying not to rip the arms off of it. Ask Reina how much money she has. Or ask her how much something costs. Jonathan sat back a bit. Unless she has looked it up online, she won't have a clue. Reina has never had to work. Her guards carry her credit cards. She lives a life where everything she wants is at her fingertips. Reina is not materialistic, Phil hissed. The vampire chuckled. No, she isn't. Not the way some people are. She is so naive and innocent that way. But tell me this, while you had her out there, his jaw tightened a bit, I'm sure you had to purchase things for her. You didn't take enough of her things when you left. Phil's lip twitched, but he stayed quiet, waiting. Did she ever worry about the money? Did she once ask how you were able to pay for the rooms, clothes, and food? I bet she didn't, because she has never had to think about those things. Reina has been sheltered in a lot of ways, but she also craves that protection. As much as she likes to run off and have her adventures, she needs to feel stable and safe. You can't give her the life she is accustomed to, and sooner or later, she will look up and see that. When Jonathan sat back, Phil leaned forward, the blood slamming through his veins. I am not a pauper, nor do I think so little of Reina to believe she is what you are accusing her of. She is smart, passionate, and naive, yes, but she would choose love over acreage, and even you know that. She only stayed at the manor because of her father. She loved being at Polson, loved being with her pack. Reina got to let her guard down there. She didn't have to try to be Mr. Beldrin's daughter. With us, she gets to be Reina, and she craves that more than anything your money could buy her ever. Jonathan shrugged. She is passionate. I have no arguments there. All things most people have to worry about, jobs, money, bills, aren't even things she wonders about. They simply don't exist to her. Tell me, has she ever asked you what you do for a living? Phil flinched then, and Jonathan sighed, trying to hide a small smile. She has no idea you work at the hardware store that your family owns in Polson. Phil felt his hands clutch the arms on the chair and only stopped when he heard the wood cracking. Jonathan stood up. She doesn't know that Track, works 2 jobs, or that Rock and Jackson work at the local grocery store. He walked around the room a bit. It doesn't even occur to her that you might work, he chuckled. That should show you how very different your 2 worlds are. Phil stood. She doesn't know because they dropped everything when she came. They work family businesses in Polson and scheduled her visits around our time off. I was not around them much. And, since you work for pack businesses, there was no problem with you taking it off for this adventure. Your point? Phil hissed. He felt his control slip more. His hackles were up and his muscles twitched. I want you to see how ridiculous it is to think you could ever be with her. You don't understand her. She is nearly full vampire, and with that comes a world you have only seen through her eyes. It's who and what she is, no matter the fantasy you try to paint for her. You have tried to make her hate her own bloodline. Tried to make her think she should hate it. He spit the last words out, clenching one fist. You have played with her mind. You have played with her heart. And yet you say you love her? What male can stand and declare such a thing and yet rip her world apart, and whispered that she should love him for it? Phil turned to face him, his own hands tensed. She is not full vampire, and with every shift, she seems less and less like one. Thanks to you, Jonathan glared, the venom dripping from his words. Phil balked, caught off guard. Me? You werewolves, Jonathan spat, forcing himself to stand where he was so he didn't lunge and rip out the throat of the man in front of him. The image of Reina was the only thing that kept him from doing it. He frowned, feeling his rage ebb as he thought about her lost in these wolves' game. How could such evil exist in this world? He knew it did, but watching it poison someone he loved was a pain that was trying to destroy him. Needing to be there for her was the only thing that kept him sane. And how exactly are we doing that? Phil said as he kept his seat. He knew that if they were both standing, the urge to attack would win in one of them. He had told Reina he would just talk, and he meant to do everything in his power to keep his word to her. As for this love you claim to have for her, he watched the bat's jaw tense. You helped hide her away from me, from her pack. You snuck her out of her home and shuffled her around as much as you're accusing us of. Her father's orders, Jonathan stated, looking over at the couch. I personally would have dealt with it immediately and not played this ridiculous game of hide-and-seek. She had a right to hear our side. Did she really? Phil frowned. Of course she did. You, meaning vampires, decided we had found some lost tribe of witches and cast some magical spell over her. He chuckled then. Even a full witch couldn't cast more than a lust potion. Everyone knows that. You can't force someone to fall madly in love with you. She is not in love with you, wolf, Jonathan hissed, his hand shaking a bit. Phil watched the male across from him. He was not a fool to think it would be an easy fight. Wolves studied their opponents when given the chance, and he was watching his now. Reina's mind has been tampered with. She and I are in love. We are coupled, and we have plans for a future together. Phil shrugged, still soaking up every moment from the other. Well then, go ask her. If she says she wants you, I won't stop her. Do I have your word on that? Phil stood then. Actually, no, you don't. You aren't the only one in this room that would fight for her. She is my mate in soul and mind. You couldn't even begin to understand. Aote? Jonathan chuckled, then tapped his chin. Let me see. Oh, yes, a story that wolves tell their children to give them hope and teach them about love. He shot Phil a hard stare. It's a nice fable, but there is no magical bonding. Whatever bonding has happened was planned and executed. Owlsaw gave home to another Aote couple. Our elders found other packs that have witnessed the same thing. Really? So where is this Owlsaw couple? I didn't see them. Phil's head shot up. You were in Owlsaw? Jonathan nodded. Yes, we got there after you took her, and at the end of the attack. Phil's eyes widened then. The attack. Wolves attack their own kind, Jonathan whispered, shaking his head. At first I believed what they told us, when we captured them. He paused to let his words sink in. They claimed that they had been outraged by what the Polson wolves had done, and they wanted to set things right. They didn't want the war they knew was coming. We had lived in peace for many hundreds of years. Polson and Blvd Manor get along because of Reina, Phil put in, a look of disgust heavy on his face. Things weren't as pleasant before. True enough, but as stated, that's what they wanted us to believe. Jonathan shook his head. I had a talk with one of them before. He shrugged and Phil winced. He told me what we all have known or should have known. There was more to all of this than just keeping the peace. Reina is the only daughter of Thomas Blvd. She is ranked higher than any other vampire under him. Kings and queens would bow to her if humans still had such open hierarchy. She knows her lineage and has lived in a giant box for it. That title has cost her a lot, mostly her freedom to enjoy life. She rarely complained about it, but it was a very hard life for her, no matter the amount of commas in a bank account. Jonathan smiled a bit then. Reina is amazing, and the most self-sacrificing person I have met. He seemed to remember himself and lifted his chin. Every non-human knows that there is only one way to get to Thomas. So she has been protected every day of her life. Until now, he frowned. Then she became even more valuable to everyone when she shifted and survived. That has created groups of non-humans that are nearly lusting to get their hands on her. Mostly wolves and vampires. The other races are so few and nearly extinct. They want her blood, Phil stated, irritated. The vampire knew he knew this. Yes, some want it while it's still in her. Others could care less how they get it. Some are becoming nearly cult-like, hungry for what they think her DNA can now provide. I know all this, Phil snapped. The one wolf told me that they were after her, but not to stop any feud. They wanted what so many others now want, her blood. Her genetic strand that has mutated enough to let her pass from one form to the other. The profitability is outrageous, he spat, glaring at the small table as if it had given the news. Phil felt a low growl in his throat. The only new information here was the intent of the pack that attacked at Owlsaw, and that didn't surprise him. He had never been under the illusion that all wolves were good. Can you protect her from all of them? Jonathan said in a hard whisper. Phil's brows rose and Jonathan turned, looking at him. Do you have the resources and technology to protect her from those that want to experiment on her? to torture her to see if she holds the secret to sunwalking or hybrid shifting or a handful of other ludicrous ideas? Phil swallowed hard and Jonathan shook his head. You don't, but I do. The wolf flinched then and Jonathan took the advantage. And what about longevity? What does that have? Wolves can live 500 years approximately, correct? Phil nodded and Jonathan spread his arms wide. Reina is 3/4 vampire. All tests have shown that she is still aging normally for a vampire. Tell me, Phil, what will happen when you are old in appearance and age and she is still young with hundreds of years still in front of her? Phil blinked then. It was something he had thought about. It had even worried him, but he was sure they would find a way. You have about another 300 years to live, give or take, Jonathan stated, a small grin on his face. The rush of getting the upper hand was moving through him. She still has at least 10 times that. Your lifespan is merely a season in hers. Suddenly, Phil felt a wave of panic rush through him. He remembered what the Owl Saw Alpha told him. When one of the Aote couple dies, the other will soon follow. His throat tightened. He had expected to live a full, long life with Reina, happy and content once this insanity was behind them. He hadn't allowed his mind to think about what would happen at the end of his own natural life. I know the stories, Jonathan replied, his calm returning now that he had seen the other's attention. She will not die if you do. That I promise with everything that I am. Phil was off his guard now, though, the thoughts swimming through his mind. He hadn't given a lot of thought to their age spans, and he mentally throttled himself for it. It hadn't seemed important. Their love would find a way. He gasped internally, cursing himself for holding on to such a romantic notion. He had always been a planner, always thought things through to make sure he was seeing something from every angle. Until that night in the cave. So, I'll let this play out a bit longer, the vampire stated as he casually sat back on the couch. But you seem to have a lot to think about. He leaned forward then. When will it ever be easy to let her go? I don't envy you that decision, but the point is, you must. If you love her like you claim to, you have to let her go now so she can recover, heal, and going back to living a long, happy, safe life. Phil stood, his anger turned inward on himself. He looked at the vampire. I love her more than you could ever understand. Do you? Jonathan stated, standing up and taking a relaxed step towards the other. If you do, then you know what the right answer is. Love is only pain-free in stories. I'm not saying I'll give her up. I know. Phil walked towards the door and then turned. I would do anything for her. Then prove it, and do the right thing for her. The growl died in Phil's throat. His hackles were down and his heart was pounding madly in his chest as he stepped out of the room and walked between the vampire pillars that didn't turn and watch him go. Instead of heading to the theater, Phil stopped a maid and asked directions to a different part of the mansion. A few minutes later, he stepped through a doorway into the night air. He inhaled deeply and walked. Back in the other room, Jonathan plopped down on the couch and ran his hands through his hair. He knew he had won, but the facts still chilled him. Reina would never be safe from the hungry hands that wanted to find the answer to their dreams in her veins. The Poulsen wolves had exposed her more, but they had also uncovered some treachery that he and Thomas had both missed. He clenched his fists together, then laid his forehead on them. Reina, I am trying so hard to go slow, he whispered. Every part of me wants to rip him into pieces for touching you. The only thing keeping his hands from destroying the vile thing that had taken her heart from him was knowing what it would do to her. He had to keep his anger in check. He had to show that wolf what he was doing to her and force him to let her go. "I miss you so much," he whispered again, his voice shaking and his knuckles white. He ignored his phone as it rang, then chuckled as a memory came to him. He pulled it out and instead of answering it, pushed a button. Then he sat back and stared at the picture of the two of them on their first date. Their heads were together, and her smile was forced and nervous. Jonathan chuckled quietly, remembering that night and staring at her face. When someone knocked, he didn't look up. He looked up but didn't answer. The pain in his heart was overwhelming, and he leaned back on the couch, laying his head on the back and looking up without seeing the arched beams. "Please," he whispered, "please remember loving me." The door opened and he frowned, lowering his head to watch a face appear. He wondered how she made it through the guards, then remembered telling them to follow the wolf. He sighed and sat up, clicked the screen blank and pushing it into his pocket. "Did you kill him and hide the body already?" Alyssa smiled, looking around. Jonathan's brows rose and she shrugged. "I'll help you come up with a story if you want." "What do you want, Alyssa?" he sighed, sitting forward. He had used all his energy keeping control with the wolf. He didn't have any more at the moment. "Reina wanted me to come check on things," she shrugged, walking over and sitting next to him. He glanced at her. He left. "Oh." She looked around and smiled. "So who won?" Jonathan chuckled without humor. "How is she?" "Reina? Who else?" "That wolf has ordered her to stay in the theater until he comes and gets her," she huffed, making rabbit ears in the air with her fingers. "Seriously, Reina Blvd cowed by a four-legged, fur-covered mutt," she hissed. Jonathan's brows lifted again. "So venomous now? You seemed quite fond of him back in the hallway." "Ugh," she huffed with a look of utter disgust. "That was because you embarrassed me. Plus, I had to, for Reina." "And since when do you care about her feelings?" "It may surprise you, but I do care." He stood up and nodded. "You're right. It does surprise me." Alyssa jumped to her feet. "Jonathan, you have got to get her back," she exclaimed, and he turned, looking at her. Those ice blue eyes were devious, and he watched them without commenting. "You can't seriously be okay with this. I know you love her." She threw her arms out. "She is a Blvd, and she's a vampire. She can't... It's..." She shivered. When Jonathan didn't reply, she drew in a breath. "I know Reina has been cooped up too long. This is her way of rebelling and trying to have an adventure. I get that." Jonathan chuckled and crossed his arms. Alyssa frowned and thrust an arm towards a far wall. "Those freaks out there are going to hunt her down and snatch her the first chance they get." She was glaring at him now. "The ones that want her dead are the most decent. The others, the things they'll do? Experiment on her?" She gasped and lowered her lip. "Try that on Trent. Not on me." "Oh, fine, but it's true," she shot out, squaring her shoulders. "Her father and I have her well protected here, and we are taking care of the rest." Again her arms flew in the air. "See? You can do that. That pack of dogs can't." Jonathan shook his head slowly. "What's in this for you?" Her eyes widened and she took a step back. Then Deciding her emotional games were not going to work, she nodded. I do care about her. She is annoying with her sweet, innocent charm that you males seem to fawn all over. She rolled her eyes. But we're family. Our family name carries a lot of weight, and the rumors are getting out of hand. Plus, she shook her head, do you realize what's going to happen if some of those people get their hands on our poor Reina? She nodded. Her father will launch an army, and our quiet, peaceful world will be flipped and shook hard. That man will destroy vampires and werewolves alike to find her. She shrugged. I don't care much about the wolves, except they do have their uses. Now he was starting to believe her. The family name, vampire honor, and upsetting her precious little socialite world that motivation he believed. And it might just be useful as well. It always helps to know someone's true fears. Well then, I guess you'll have to get used to being a shut-in as well. He stepped up a bit closer and nodded. Once she claims herself to that mutt, or is claimed by their carelessness, your soft, sweet, tea-top world is going to come crashing down. Alyssa put a hand on her stomach and he shrugged. A war unlike anything this living world has ever seen. He lowered his voice and nodded when she flinched. Everyone will go underground, into hiding, trying to wait it out. Vampire will turn against vampire, wolf against wolf. No more pretty parties, no balls, no coupling ceremonies where people laugh and celebrate. It will be dark ages ahead. Okay, now who's being dramatic? She huffed, rolling her eyes. He smiled. Theatrical, maybe, but completely truthful. She flinched, knowing he was right. You have to get her back. She's a vampire, Jonathan, and they are making her forget that. When he didn't reply, she smiled. I'll help you. And why is it you think I need your help? Because you do now. She asked me to come here and check things out because Phil, she hissed the name, has told our Reina to sit and stay like a good little puppy. Jonathan's jaw twitched and she bit back her smile. He wasn't the only one that knew how to hit below the belt. Since you're still here and he's the one that left, and because he didn't go straight to her, you got him, she nodded, turning and looking around the room. You planted doubt, probably with guilt. Did you bring up the longevity thing? He blinked and nodded slowly. Good, because that is a serious issue, she stated, now pacing a bit as she talked. Plus, it's completely true and justifiable. It's logic he will have to look at. What about... She stopped when he put his hand up. Alyssa, I may have used logic and tactics to talk to him, but I understand one thing. I do love Reina. She is the only thing that matters to me. Yes, I know. True love sounds great. Now, here's what I think we should do. A few minutes later, Alyssa went to leave. Jonathan blocked her way. If you hurt Reina in any way through this, I will take out every ounce of the anger I have for that wolf on you. When her eyes widened, he nodded slowly, staring at her. Reina would not hate me as much for killing you. She swallowed hard and stared at him. Her posture slumped and a fear crawled through her. Somehow, she knew he wasn't speaking figuratively. He would kill for her cousin. A pang of jealousy crept over the fear, but the cold gray eyes pulled the fear back to the forefront. This was about survival. Survival of her lifestyle, which was built on her family's name, and now keeping her cool skin completely intact. Alyssa nodded, and he stepped aside, seeing the fear and then understanding flicker in her eyes. Once she was far enough down the hallway, she shivered hard, trying to shake the feeling of those hard eyes on her. Jonathan was more like her uncle than she thought. Both men were beyond powerful, a power that crossed over all the races whether they knew it or not, and they both loved one girl. He was right. This world would cower if anything happened to her. She knew one thing. She had every intention on being on the winning side, and that meant getting Jonathan and her uncle their precious little Reina back. She and I will be best friends, she thought as she hurried down the hall. I have to make myself indispensable to her. It was the only way to be pulled under her cousin's powerful umbrella of protection. Alyssa was a lot of things, but stupid was rarely one of them. She could act the part if needed, but underneath there was usually a plan. When she walked into the theater, the four heads turned, and she quickly shut the door to keep the light out. She winced at the bloody scene on the screen, but tiptoed down the row and sat behind Reina, who turned and looked over the half-reclined chair. They finished talking, she whispered, and wasn't surprised when the other three heads appeared. Phil left. He wasn't there when I got there. Where'd he go? Jackson asked. She shrugged. I don't know. Jonathan doesn't know either. Was he black and blue and laying on the floor when you found him? Rock asked, pretending to sound alarmed. Track and Jackson laughed, but Reina shushed them. What do you think happened? I don't know, Alyssa replied. Jonathan was very quiet and wouldn't say much. Track huffed and Jackson flopped back in the chair. Great, and now we're all stuck here. I'm sure Phil doesn't expect you to just sit and wait. Reina sighed and Alyssa frowned. Really? She asked, keeping the sarcasm out and sounding genuinely surprised. Just as her cousin nodded, someone's phone rang. Dal turned as Track pulled his phone out, hit a button, and put it to his ear. He listened for a minute and then hung up. Phil said we can go. He'll meet up with us later. Where is he? Reina asked, and Alyssa watched her reaction closely. He said he has some business to take care of. Alyssa stood and reached her hand over the back of the other's chair. Come on, cousin. Let's you and I have some girl time. Jackson laughed hard, and Rock grunted as he pulled himself up. Reina stood, her eyes tight. I think I should go find Phil. Man's business, Alyssa chuckled. Ryan probably found him and has him in some boring meeting. She wiggled her outstretched hand, and Reina looked at it. No, I think I should go find him. I have to make sure he's okay. Okay, Alyssa replied, reaching forward quickly and grabbing the unsplinted hand. Let's go find Phil. Reina's eyes shot open, and Alyssa smiled. Back in the other room, Jonathan pulled out his phone out of his pocket and looked at the screen. He hit the button and said hello. Meet me in my room immediately. And then there was a click. Jonathan's eyes widened and he rushed to the door, nearly ripping it off its hinges. Luckily, the house was built for vampire strength, and it only flew open part way and then slowed. He didn't notice and ran down the hall towards Thomas Beldren's room. As he neared the set of double doors, his panic doubled. Michaud was standing outside. Why aren't you with Reina? He hissed as the guard reached for the handle to let him in. Orders, the massive private guard stated, then looked at him. Martin and 2 others are with her. Jonathan frowned but nodded and walked inside the room. Thomas was standing in the sitting suite of the enormous room. Dr. Alexander was with him. His eyes scanned the room and he stepped up closer to them. They were the only ones in the room. Thomas nodded at him, and he noticed that the doctor was nearly bouncing with excitement. His frown deepened, and he stopped in front of them. The doctor has brought me the report from Reina's blood draw, Thomas stated, and Jonathan saw a look flash across the high vampire's face that he was seeing too much of lately. Fear. Just a flicker of it, hidden behind the rage and frustration. When Jonathan looked at the doctor, he blurted out the information with his eyes wide and the smile plastered across his face. It's her DNA. It's changing, he started, and Jonathan crossed his arms. This wasn't new. Vampires have a very specific DNA structure, as do wolves, the doctor continued, nodding to himself as he spoke. Before, she would show the basic hybrid structure with slight variances. But now, he grinned. What? Jonathan snapped and looked at Thomas. When the latter only nodded, Jonathan turned back to the doctor. Is she becoming something else? In a way, then again, not really. It's always been there, you see, the doctor stated. She still has the basic structure of a hybrid, but with a new technology, I was able to decode more of the strands. In doing so, I found something. He slapped his hands together like a human that had just touched the moon. Jonathan's fists clenched, and he wondered if he'd finally found a target for his anger. The doctor's smile faltered, and then he put one hand up when Jonathan stepped towards him. It does not appear to be harming her, or even shortening her lifespan. Then what does it mean? Jonathan's hand shook. I have been able to nearly completely decode the entire strand. Thomas, our records show as much. Vampires are meticulous about our ancestry. Just listen, Thomas said quietly. Jonathan's lip twitched, and he looked back at the doctor, whose eyes sparkled with excitement. Reina's vampire strand is pure, as far back as possible. Or it was, he shrugged, again to himself, and then flinched when Jonathan's arm moved a bit. What do you mean, was? Jonathan hissed, and Thomas sighed. It took me a while to get him to put it so I could even understand. She has two parts, one vampire, the other wolf. They are like ropes woven from her lineage. The rope is a whole thing, but made of strands wrapped around each other. In hybrids, there are separate strands for each race that have learned to coexist in the same rope. He shrugged and cracked his neck. In our kind, the strands can tell our heritage all the way back to the beginning. It's that specific. Wolf strands are a bit more muddied, since they tend to crossbreed more. So on the wolf side, there can be fluctuations, impurities. The doctor's head bobbed. Yes, somewhere down her wolf lineage, there was another race introduced. He was babbling like an excited child, and Jonathan fought the urge to slam him into something. Do you know what it is? He asked in a tight voice. The doctor nodded, and Jonathan shook his head, running a hand through his hair. Her mother's wolf lineage was contaminated with DNA from another race? Suddenly, he felt Thomas's eyes, and he looked up at the man, seeing something else flicker there. What is it? Jonathan asked quietly. Well now, first I must say it appears to be rather distant, the doctor frowned at the ground, but with this type, I can't really be sure. It was dormant, so how long is... What is it? Jonathan spat, his head down and his eyes tight as he glared at the messenger. Which? The doctor gushed quickly, flinching and taking a step back. Chapter 8. Jonathan's head shot up, his eyes wide. Which? He asked in a whisper, and the doctor nodded, then smiled. It actually answers a lot of questions, and I believe it explains why she has been able to shift without going mad, like nearly 99.947% of all other hybrids. Which? Jonathan whispered again, turning and looking around the room without seeing it. There hasn't been a known witch in centuries, Thomas stated, a slight hit of excitement in his hard reply. Jonathan's mind spun. Witches had been captured and kept as treasures by vampires and a few other races. So much so they had went extinct, leaving the ones that coveted them to blame for it. Ironic. Which? He asked again, turning back to the others. Thomas chuckled. It would explain a lot. Yes, it would, Jonathan whispered, still trying to grasp what he was hearing. He had seen witches before, and they were beautiful things to behold. Their faces were soft and almost surreal. Their eyes were the picture of innocence, and you wanted desperately to be around them. Unfortunately, vampires and their lust for the best took that desire too far. He had never owned one himself. He came from the generation of new-thinking vampires. The thought disgusted him. Sadly, that generation was also a bit self-absorbed and didn't pay attention to the dwindling numbers of these marvelous creatures. He had met a free witch once, and she had been one of the most amazing beings he had ever met. He closed his eyes and pushed his mind back to the time, past all the other years. He had found her in a secluded mountain region, or, more accurately, she had found him. She had welcomed him into her home, and they sat and talked for 4 days. He was hungry, but didn't want to leave. He had sat in her home, built out of forged sticks and handmade clay, and listened to her talk about anything and everything. Her voice, he shivered, was so soft and sweet. It made him feel safe and comforted. The hunger grew, though, and he started to look at her with that need. She saw it in his eyes, but never spoke of it. He left while she slept, but he remembered leaning over her, watching her form, the battle raging inside of him, wondering what the blood of such a thing would taste like. He winced, remembering how disgusted he was with himself once he fed far away from her. He never went back, partly out of embarrassment, but mostly out of the fear as the hunger still tickled in his mind. The witch DNA is blending with one of the strands. Jonathan blinked out of his memories as the doctor continued. It is so very slight, nearly impossible to detect, but her wolf strand is... It's changing her werewolf DNA? No, actually it is coding it, to use layman's terms, the doctor chuckled. Both vampire and werewolf DNA are unchanged, but the witch DNA, he smiled wide, thrilled beyond belief to be using that word in present tense. It is coding it, touching the strand at the most primitive level, like holding its hand. The doctor pursed his lips in thought and then shrugged. You could say that. I guess it would be a comparable thesis. He perked up and bobbed his head. It hid itself so well, mirrored itself to the DNA around it, making it absolutely impossible to find until it woke. Jonathan blinked hard. Aote. Thomas nodded. It could be. Yes, the doctor chimed. It could be that her coming of age, as the werewolves put it, triggered an awakening of this strand. And since it was shortly after that the situation happened, he shrugged, still grinning and his eyes twinkled. So that wolf just happened to be there when this happened to happen to her. Not necessarily, but to a point. Jonathan growled, and the doctor flinched again. From what I have been told about that night, she was crazed and didn't remember who she was. I think the witch DNA had awoken, and the surge in her molecular skeleton, coupled with the intense destruction and reconstruction of her shifts. He was in the right place at the right time, Thomas stated, shooting the doctor an annoyed look. The doctor shrugged. Technically. Although there is still a question of why him as opposed to... He shrugged again. All mostly theories at this point, but amazing. Imagine it. He yelped. They were never able to successfully breed a witch with a vampire. That could be why the vampire strand is still untouched. They may not be compatible even in this amazing event. Or, he shrugged again, it could simply be that it was placed there through her werewolf genes. Or, Jonathan groaned. Another part of his racist past to be ashamed of. They certainly didn't fail due to lack of trying, whether the witches consented or not. Even lab attempts to interbreed failed, the doctor went on, unaffected by the truth behind the history he was spewing out. When combined with any other DNA, the witch strand simply disintegrated. He rubbed his fingers together and then pulled his hands apart, usually destroying the host. He shrugged and frowned, though the other two men knew his sadness was only for the loss of the science. Obviously, it worked once, Jonathan replied quietly, still in awe of what he was hearing. The doctor's heads bobbed. Yes, and now your amazing, unique Reina has become... She is my daughter, period, Thomas spat, and the doctor frowned. Has he told anyone else? Jonathan asked, looking at Thomas, his mind now spinning in another direction. Not a bean, the doctor put in quickly, looking back and forth between the two men. I haven't even logged it. I was instructed not to write a single note or keep any logs after the leak with the others, he stated, with a turned-up nose towards his prior colleagues. Will this harm her? Jonathan asked, watching the doctor, but also reading Reina's father's body language. I don't see how, Dr. Alexander smiled. In fact, it seems to be doing remarkable things to her. How do you know it won't? Well, I'm not 100% certain, mind you, but the tests so far show no signs of damage to the original strands, and her longevity is still intact and firm. You see, the molecules are not destroying or replacing the werewolf ones. They are actually weaving around them, adding to them, the man sighed, smiling. It's not something anyone thought possible, and has actually never been thought possible, even in theory. You see, DNA... Can you remove it? Jonathan stated. His throat tightened from the information and all that it could mean. Remove it? The doctor gasped, and when both men watched him, he finally shook his head. No, the coating is permanent. When I tried to extract a sample from the host strand, it shattered the entire sample. Thank you, Doctor, Thomas said, and the doctor nodded and went quiet. I want you to return to your lab and destroy all of the evidence. What? But, sir... Now, Thomas stated in a voice so calm even Jonathan flinched a bit. The doctor nodded as Thomas called out and Michael stepped in. See the good doctor to his lab and make sure everything is destroyed, including the computers and equipment. I want any viable materials soaked and burned beyond retrieval. Sir, really, this is... The doctor pleaded as Michael nodded and took the doctor by his arm. Michael, the head vampire stated coolly, when it's done, come and see me, and keep him, he gestured toward the doctor, under lock and key. The massive guard nodded, turned, and left the room, taking the white-coated man with him. Jonathan watched them leave, knowing it was possible the last bit of information he would get out of the vampire physician, but it had to be done. This information could never get out. Get my daughter away from that wolf, Thomas spat in a low whisper when the room was cleared. Jonathan turned. I have every intention of doing just that. You have 3 days to do it your way. Then we do it mine. If we act too fast, or I would rather face her wrath and spend the next 100 years begging her forgiveness than to have her in that creature's arms any longer. If they find out, how could they? Thomas turned then, his eyes tight. We don't know that they don't already know. What? How? Not these petty pack dogs, he hissed. There are greater things at work here. Right now, you get her back where she's safe. He stormed towards the door. We have to make anyone that might be watching and waiting believe that this has failed. We also cannot show that we have this information. Right now, they haven't made any serious attempts to take her. If they think we know, they will try harder. Do not draw attention. Keep it to matters that we already knew. They took my daughter, your fiancé, and we think they messed with her memory. Who could be behind this? Jonathan gasped, shaking his head. What are you... With that, Thomas left, shutting the door behind him. For several minutes, Jonathan stood in a shocked stupor as the past few minutes replayed themselves in his mind, and then mixed with his past memories. Finally, they ebbed enough, and Thomas's words slapped him into action. This time, the door wasn't so lucky. It creaked and tilted on his hinges as he rushed through it. The first 2 hallways were empty. Grumbling under his breath, he yanked his phone out, flipped past the pictures of them smiling, and pushed another button. There, he entered a code and then watched the screen as a small blip appeared. He lifted his head, looked around, and turned down another hallway. And that's where I'm going to stop.